All right, folks, and here we are with the final installment of European imperialism. This one is largely going to focus on European expansion in Asia, both North Asia and East Asia. So we'll start first with Russia on the mainland of North and Central Asia. Remember, Russian imperial expansion had largely been confined in the era of, let's say, Peter the Great through Catherine the Great to expansion largely on its western frontier into sections of Europe, picking at the remains of the Polish state, taking territories from the Ottomans north of the Black Sea. Alongside of that also went a significant expansion already into Central Asia, across Siberia to the Pacific Ocean, and then in the latter 19th century, really southward down through Central Asia, those areas around the old Silk Road trade routes, which we would today roughly call like Kazakhstan, very large territory in Central Asia. The Transcaucasus, the steppes, and we would also look at this sort of the northern parts, not southern parts, northern parts of the Middle East. All of this with the goal to breaking out into the Indian Ocean, those trade routes in there. That, of course, is going to be stymied by the British, who want to see no Russian territorial expansion that would threaten India. So, so for instance, as the Persian Empire begins to weaken, as the Russians begin to apply pressure on the old Persian kingdom, the British step in and create essentially spheres of influence, a British sphere of influence in southern Persia and a Russian sphere of influence in the north, thus limiting, allowing the Russians some leeway, but in the end, confining them to a sort of territorial Asian-based empire and not breaking out into that Indian Ocean zone that could threaten India. Here we see Russia in the Middle East or in Central Asia. One could say that the Russian experience in Central Asia is occurring at around the same time and with a sort of a similar feel to the way the U.S. expansion in the Old West was, encountering Native American tribes, nomadic peoples, horse nomads, and so on. That's essentially what Russian imperialism during this time was like. The Western powers in Asia. This is sort of the last round of imperialism and will be regarded by many students of empires today as to be kind of the overextension of imperialism, especially, let's say, within the British context. Let's look first at the French in Asia. Their interest was largely in Southeast Asia, what was called French Indochina, that area between India and China, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. French intervention in this area begins as early as the 1850s and 60s, and will culminate by the 1880s in more or less a standard type of French imperial government in the area. The British, in order to block them, expand into Burma to block French access to India. So Burma serves as a sort of British buffer zone in that direction. The one thing that's not, well, we'll mention that in a moment. Sorry. In the United States also gets involved in Asia and the Pacific. Perry's expedition to Asia and Japan in particular, opening up of Japan in 1853. This is part of the whole Meiji Restoration in Japan, the attempt to be more engaged with the West, and the modernization of Japan as a result of that. U.S. purchase of Alaska and the Aleutians in 1867, and of course finally the Spanish-American War, which will gain the U.S. the Philippines sort of in the heart of the East Asian trade routes. Now, arguably the most important new thing with the Western powers getting involved in East Asia is how they approach China. China is not susceptible, let's say, as many parts of Africa are, or even many former territories in the Ottoman Empire, or the declining status of the Mughal Empire in India, where Western powers could come in, play off various regional factions, and then engage in sort of a wholesale takeover of the region, implementing Western-style imperial governments, viceroys, and so forth. China is just not ripe for that. There is still an imperial center. China is just too large. Its hinterlands too vast and populated for Europeans to create any kind of a tremendous land-based presence in China. However, China is susceptible, as we saw with the Opium Wars, of military dominance and the establishment of regional spheres of influence, particularly in coastal cities. So that the British might enter into one city, establish a resident who was the shadow of the local mayor, and on a very local level could sort of engage in that kind of imperialism that we might see in India. So you might still technically have a Mughal emperor in India, but there's a British governor general of the East India Company who was ostensibly calling the shots while the rest of the Indians were still doing homage to their emperor. It's a little bit more localized in China. In that particular region or that particular city and its immediate hinterlands, you would have a British or a French or an American resident who was essentially the diplomatic envoy to China in that time. We could say a consulate in the consulate's office. And they would then coordinate with the local ruling elite and essentially calling the shots that were amenable to that particular foreign power. Those deals were hammered out with the imperial government. So for all intents and purposes, we talk about spheres of influence of a variety of European Western countries, in the eastern parts of China. This exacerbates tensions within China itself. We saw the Opium Wars. We'll see the rebellions in the middle of the 19th century, the Sino-Japanese War that goes disastrously for China. All of these conflicts are going to create great dissatisfaction with the imperial government, the Qin government, and this open door policy, this spirit of acquiescence to the military superiority of Western powers eventually triggers a local rebellion, a Chinese rebellion, that is directed against the foreigners and against sort of rescuing the imperial government from Western European interventionists and imperialists. And so you have the development of the Society for the, I think it's the Society for the Peaceful and Harmonious Fists, as they're known. They were a group of rebels that believed that with great training in the martial arts and in traditional Chinese calisthenics, that they would be able to resist the effect of bullets. And because the British observed them doing these sort of rituals, they called it shadow boxing, and thus gave the nickname to the society. They called them the Boxers, and thus the Boxer Rebellion. The Boxers actually were a very large contingent, mostly from the Shandong province, which is just to the east of Peking along the coast. It's a little Shandong Peninsula. And they actually lay siege to Beijing, and they really show, first of all, the internal weakness of the imperial government, even at the hands of Chinese rebels. Interestingly enough, it's Western powers. It's the combined forces of the Germans, the French, the Americans, the British, the Russians that sort of collaborate together to relieve the siege and therefore support the imperial government. So in this instance, imperialism in Asia means, as it does, let's say, in the Ottoman Empire, Europeans propping up the imperial edifice in order to take maximum advantage of it. It still needs to be in place. Much in the same way that up until the Sepoy Rebellion, the British were very interested in propping up the Mughal government. Much the same case that all the way through until World War I, the French and the British were very interested in making sure that the Ottoman Empire and the Ottoman Sultanate was inviolate at the hands of Russia, and propping up that important regional power because they didn't want a power vacuum. The same thing holds true in China. Europeans realized they cannot create, they cannot carve out, like they did in Africa, China up among the various powers. It would create far too much tension among the Europeans. And so therefore the decision was to take collective action to actually support the imperial government in China, which will last until 1911, when again the Qing government succumbs to a nationalist Republican rebellion and the establishment of a republic in China. And here we see Japanese forces, U.S. forces. This looks to me like British forces over here relieving the siege of the Forbidden City in Peking. So here we have some maps of the age of imperialism. All right, it shows, we can see here the dots along the side over here. These are the spheres of influence cities. Here's the Dutch Empire down here. Here's the French Empire in Indochina, the U.S. in the Philippines, the British in Burma, the British in India, and then of course the Ottoman Empire over here. We can see that Egypt, which was once part of the Ottoman Empire in 1880, is no longer by the eve of World War I. Now, let's just pause for a moment, and we can see in part what's happening here is let's say for the British to control India, to control Burma, to control its territories here in eastern China, Australia, which is off the map. The British have to assume one thing, that there is no other imperial power that could threaten the British Navy in the Far East. And, you know, the United States would certainly develop a Pacific Fleet, but the United States was largely seen as a fellow imperialist and part of that sort of Anglo-American rapprochement that occurred after the War of 1812. The Russians were a potential military threat. Where the British are caught a little off guard was when Russia and Japan go to war right around the turn of the century. And the Japanese deal not only with the Russian Far East Fleet, but then when the Russian Baltic Fleet sails all the way around Africa and finally gets to Japan, is also defeated. All of a sudden, a new power in the region, Japan, a new naval power in the region, has arisen. And the British are slightly alarmed by this and engage in some very serious diplomacy, and Britain and Japan become allies. And they become allies all the way through World War I. And in effect, sort of neutralizing the power of Japan in the Far East is a way of basically getting the British to have an ally on the spot who will defend British interests in the spot, on the spot. Namely, the naval forces of Japan. Well, of course, that policy only works insofar as the Japanese are willing to play along with that. They are through World War I. Of course, as we all know, they are not willing to play along with the British in the conflict that we call World War II. So just a little looking forward about how imperialism brings us well down into the 20th century in terms of these rivalries. Again, the Boxer Rebellion, technology in the Far East. Right? The cable systems, the transatlantic cable systems, telecommunications, so vital to controlling these empires. Other things that are vital to controlling these empires, as Winston Churchill remarked, here's the Maxim gun. Um, okay. Other elements that are important uh, in the latter part of the age of imperialism, the missionary factor. We have evangelical Protestant missionaries, back in the home countries that are established, societies that are established to convert the heathen lands. Roman Catholic missionary had been around since the 17th century as part of the Counter-Reformation. That's given a shot in the arm during this time, especially in East Asia, more so with Catholic missionaries. Protestant missionaries more in places like Burma and India and parts of Africa. Okay. Of course, there would be tensions between missionaries and imperial administrators. There being two different goals, right? One is to really create congregations out of the native inhabitants. The other is to rule over them. Effectively, what's the status of an indigenous person if they adopt Christianity? If you're supposed to be a Christian government, as most European governments would have claimed at that time, how do you treat now people who are not just these little backward, unenlightened people, but who have embraced the true light and the true meaning of the cross of Jesus Christ and will share in an eternal reward in heaven with you because of that faith? That makes it much more difficult for imperial administrators to kind of govern their populations. So there'll be tension with missionaries. As we saw tension with missionaries going back to Bartolomé de las Casas in the Spanish Empire, eventually many of the religious folk come around to say, the way in which the government treats these people is unjust. Right. This sort of reminds me of the Gilbert and Sullivan operetta, The Mikado, when the three young ladies come out and sing "Three little maids from school are we, come from the ladies' seminary," right? Establishment, for young ladies in Christian education, right? And we see the matron here being looking like a very eminent Victorian. Finally, we can't look at these. We can't help but look at the scientific angle of imperialism. In the realm of botany, one could argue that Darwin's expedition was very much part of an imperial scientific agenda to go around, explore the world, to catalog the world, to see where there might be, new applications to new products that are unknown to the Western mind. Certainly commercial applications, yeah, it's about making money. The establishment of botanical gardens back at home. It's one thing to have a book with pictures of everything in it, but let's have a botanical garden in which all these greenhouses, where all these things from all over the world are on display. Okay. Granted, Darwin's expedition was much more zoological, right? Seeing different plant and animal species, particular animal species around the world. Applications to medicine. Certainly Europeans are bringing with them certain types of medicines as part of their quote-unquote civilizing mission, right? To bring cure for diseases, for tropical diseases. The Panama Canal would not be constructed were it not for the application of quinine to treat malaria and typhoid and those types of things. It was one of the things that bankrupted the previous French company who tried to build the canal. Once that hurdle is overcome, then the construction on the canal can go forward. Yellow fever and so on. And then, of course, anthropology, right? The racial thinking and how that developed through linguistics, through social Darwinism, and how that impacts imperial policy moving forward. The challenge of that, of course, is going to come when let's say, in the liberal British Empire, the best and the brightest of India are taken, educated at Oxford and Cambridge, all of a sudden are, these very well-spoken lawyers, classic British, Let's take the natives, let's educate them, let's give them all these opportunities, and then lo and behold, we're irritated when they're thinking rational human beings who think just like us and who offer convincing arguments that oppose our imperial policy, right? It's Mahatma Gandhi in some regards it picks up in so many of the traditions of the American Revolution. He's this well-educated man with a Western educational background, and he sees the whole idea behind national sovereignty and national self-determination, all these nationalist ideas that were emerging in Europe, and he says, well, wait a minute, why can't we Indians be nationalists too? And so the Indian National Congress is formed that requires that in order for India to realize its nationalism, it must in fact be independent. So there's another set of issues that imperialism raises. When we look at nationalism in Europe, that was a very confined conversation. How nationalism unifies Italy and Germany, how nationalism pulls apart at Russia and Austria and the Ottomans. Nationalism is also going to start pulling apart at the British Empire, at the French Empire, as the ruled populations begin to adopt more and more and more of the intellectual traditions of their European rulers. They will also adopt this, in many ways, similar biases, similar intellectual trajectories that will lead them to embrace nationalism as well in their own regions. We see this to some extent even today, still playing out in parts of the Middle East, where nationalism has been discouraged by Europeans, but nationalism is still very much part of the intellectual trajectory of many Middle Eastern states. It's either nationalism, on one hand, which Europeans are nervous about because Europeans had bad experiences with nationalism in the 1930s and 40s, or it's Islamicization, which is something that Europeans are even more alarmed at now. So these issues of imperialism, nationalism, decolonization eventually by the middle of the 20th century, these are all issues that are very germane to our 21st century world. So anyway, I hope that these series of lectures on imperialism were in some ways illuminating. For now, however, we will leave it here. We will look in the next series of lectures at how imperialism will lead us towards the path imperialism which globalizes the European powers will lead us on a path to a global European conflict. For now, however, thank you very much for listening.